Greetings all! Time for a very long overdue Q&A. Quite frankly, I have been busy as heck. And actually I have half a mind to take a leaf out of Ian or Bernard's book and just do one question at a time, but for now we'll stay as normal. Anyway, before I kick off, I'm going to address the audio elephant. And many of you have noticed that the audio in some of my recent videos has been a little bit lacking in quality compared to some of the earlier ones. This is exacerbated by the fact that I record videos in batches, so I don't notice if there is a problem until after I've been recording all day. The joy of being a one-man band at this. This also means that though I have taken remedial steps, they won't be obvious for a while as I go through my backlog of recorded material. So here's what's been going on. The first dodgy video I recorded was the history of Austrian armour with France, which I had thought was just user error on my part. I had forgotten to move the receiver closer to the transmitter as moved around the museum. Lesson learned, so I thought. Then I went to Fort Lee, and that batch really was user error. I must have turned up the gain a bit too high on the audio recorder or something like that. And then combined with a physical cable break that I didn't notice until halfway through one of the vehicles. So the quality on that batch is a little bit variable, and one video I don't think is releasable at all. At this point, I purchased a shotgun microphone to be used as a backup audio source. Just as well I did, since it seems my problem with the wireless microphones was not user error after all, and there's something physically wrong with the bloody things. The end result was that's why I had to merge two audio tracks for the AFV video, and probably the next one I recorded up there as well, and one has just failed miserably and the guy can't release it. And that is why there's a fair bit of background noise, as the shotgun mic was used to pick up my questions, whilst Lieutenant Colonel Costa's mic was much clearer, as his generally worked. So, upon my return from Michigan, I have since spent a lot more money to buy replacement wireless systems. Fortunately, the Patreon income has allowed me to increase the quality, read expense, of the equipment that I get. So every purchase of equipment has allowed for a step up in output quality. Now it'll take a little while for this to become apparent to you because of the whole video record release delay schedule, but it will get there. So anyway, that done, on to the questions. As ever, priority to the patrons, but some questions have been taken from elsewhere, starting with John Rayberger. Has anything coming out of Ukraine genuinely surprised me? There we go, starting off with the Ukraine question. And it is a bit of a difficult question. So I've already mentioned my astonishment at the overall level of incompetence demonstrated by the Russians at the beginning of the war. But I have to say I am coming up with very little else otherwise. Now, partially I'm sure it's because we will see something, and it's with the benefit of hindsight in a few minutes to mull things over. So I'll look at something and say, well, yeah, that actually makes sense now that I think about it. I mean, technological solutions like how to fit harms to a MiG-29 are surprising to a point, but really it's just an engineering challenge and it should be known to be solvable. The Ukrainian Uber artillery app, for lack of a better term, is creative and effective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best answer for a NATO military. I've been surprised by the ability of the Ukrainians to absorb so many different types of equipment, but again, that's just an organizational, administrative problem which can be worked through. It's not as if we don't have a history in previous wars of operating a good mix of weapons and equipment anyway. So really, I don't think there's anything as much that is surprising as much that watching the conflict has either forced us to remember things which we have left go by the wayside, such as digging in, maintaining air guards, proper concealment, or else reinforcement as important things which we were already looking at improving, but not really talking about in public discourse, like electronic emissions control or counter-drone air defense. They were already working on these things, just if you didn't look for it, you wouldn't know. Oscar, what books would you recommend to someone who is new to tanks? Well, that could be an extremely broad question and will depend a lot on what you want to get out of your reading. I mean, technical books like Honeycutt or Panzer tracts are actually pretty easy to understand once you get into them, but they do lack any larger context. Then there are those which speak more to how they were used, such as the ID's The Infantry's Armour or Gilbert's Marine Tact Battles of the Pacific, which discuss things like sustainment and operation at a lower echelon field level. For just a good general, this is how to look at tanks, there is much to recommend Steve Zaloga's book, Armored Champion, which takes a look at the tanks both at the holistic level of winning wars and at the pointy end level of crewmen trying to survive a battle once engaged. There are only 11,000 views on the video so far, but click on the link below for a 2-hour interview with Steve on this book. Alexander H. Do I have anything on the use of chieftains in the Iran-Iraq war? Short answer, no, I don't. It's not something I've taken the time to look up, and I don't think any of my resources easily available to me have anything on it. Sorry. It's a bit like the India-Pakistan tank battles. I mean, it's on my list of things to research if I ever have the time. There is even great debate on whether T-62s could or could not kill Chieftain. There's a photo of one claimed to be destroyed frontally by 2 turret penetrations from a T-62. But some Brits are saying that's just pro-Soviet coping and that it required T-72 125mm guns to do it. On the other hand, there are those who say that a refusal to accept that T-62 can kill Chieftain is just British coping. And the 115 was a good gun, in fairness. I guess the question is, are there any trials reporting of 115mm fired at an actual Chieftain in the archives? I haven't seen any. Maybe somebody else who has can mention down below. I'll pin the comment. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning, what would you recommend for a young boy's first 1 to 35th armoured vehicle? Now, you mentioned that your daughter decided to do an M18. The catch with using a vehicle like that for a first model is that it's twice as fiddly, as there's an open top, so you need to build and paint not only the outside but the inside as well. So I would recommend something with a roof. It's actually not as simple a question though, as there is an automatic desire to give the kids something cheap and low quality. Obviously you want to avoid anything modern with thousands of pieces, including individual track links and photo etch, but there is a difference between a basic model and a cheap model. I have encountered in my time some cheap and old models which are so poorly made that putting them together is absolutely infuriating. Type 98 and Osario by Trumpeter are 2 of them. Actually, if I see that Revell EC-135 was absolutely atrocious, quite possibly the worst kit I've ever built. The pieces don't even come close to fitting correctly. So what you want to do is you want to look for a kit which isn't too fiddly, but which also doesn't require all sorts of sanding and filling just to get tab A to fit into slot B. So you won't go too far wrong with one of the 1980s or 1990s Tamiya kits, for example. Modern enough to go together without frustration, but not so modern as to have modern enthusiast standards of detail and fiddly bits. For what it's worth, my first proper tank kit was Tamiya's Leopard 1. I mean, other ones from that era, the M60, the Challenger, the Amtrak, the Martyr, those would all be pretty reasonable. Reichsbeer Minister, how much and in what way have missions or operations changed for a tank commander or platoon leader from World War II to the last deployment? What tasks have come and gone? Has it gotten easier or more difficult? Would a tank platoon leader from 1945 be able to handle an M1 platoon in the modern day? Honestly, I don't think there's particularly all that much difference. If I pulled out the tank platoon manual from 1942 and the one from 2010, much of the basics would be identical. What has changed is the speed at which modern combat happens, not the tactical part of it, as it were. So you can see the enemy faster, you will kill the enemy faster, you can communicate faster, you can call in artillery faster, yet the skills required will be the same. You'll have to manage your people. Private Snuffy is still going to do dumb private things. You have to be able to form some form of troop leading procedures. You have to maintain the tank at crew level and deal with the mechanics at higher levels, but again, the speed of repair today is faster, but in both cases, just follow the manual. Bore sighting today is still bore sighting, it's just more precisely done, but the concept is the same. At the tactical level, fire and movement is still a thing. You can split your platoon into sections, or you can go as one alongside other platoons in the company. And you also have to both monitor your own radio net and understand what's going on at a higher level. So yeah, I think a World War II platoon leader or tank commander could operate a modern M1 platoon once given the technical conversion course in the operation and capabilities of friendly and threat equipment. Mike Quinton: why was the T-34-76's gun enclosed in a long shroud or mantle, but the Sherman or Panzer had a more traditional mantlet? The short answer is that the designer decided to put the cradle and recoil and recuperation cylinders further forward than on the other guns. Now, the image I'm showing right now is an F-32, because I can't seem to find a great photo of the F-34 without the shroud, oddly enough, but it should get the concept of the design across. Compare with the mount of the 75mm gun M3 as found on Sherman, and you'll see that the Sherman's recoil cylinders are side by side of the gun behind the trunnions, but F-32s are under the gun in front of the trunnions. It's a balance. The recoil mechanism either has to take up room inside the turret, or it sticks outside the turret where it's more vulnerable. Soviet tank turrets like T-34-76 weren't known for being the most spacious things in the first place, so it's a way of getting a little bit more room back in for the crewman. Mike Quinton: one reason Striker MGS was retired is that the cost of keeping the autoloader fixed wasn't worth it, and the Department of the Army wanted to put the money somewhere else. If money were not an object, was MGS worth saving? Well, yes, in the fantasy world that we have enough money, much as the Marines would probably have kept its tanks if it had enough money. The idea of a 105mm gun to support the infantry is obviously good enough that the Army's buying MPF. I don't think the ideal has disappeared from striker units. It will be interesting to speculate on whether MPF could be fielded to striker units, but a fundamental difference is that a striker unit still has armored vehicles and a 40mm or caliber 50 machine gun, and those aren't really terrible weapon systems to find on top of the vehicles. So again, there is a question of if it's worth the expense to add yet another vehicle type with the 105. Infantry units don't have those armored platforms for remote weapon systems really, so the 105 MPF makes more value sense for them. Was it technological limitations or design inertia which kept the transmission in the front of a tank, which required a drive shaft going the length of the vehicle until the advent of the power pack? Yes. Nuxes asks, I'll go back right quick. Obviously, countries such as the USSR and the UK showed that it was technically possible to create a tank with a rear engine and rear drive right the way through World War II, but it wasn't something that the Americans did until Pershing. There were a couple of advantages to having the transmission forward. The first is accessibility for maintenance. The engine isn't in the way if you have to get at the transmission for whatever reason. Secondly, there are no problems with linkages. Gear shift levers don't need to run controls all the way from the front of the tank to the back, so the gear stick for a Sherman or a Swedish L60 is connected straight into the gearbox. It makes operating a tank much easier. See T-34s and the Sledgehammer. Obviously, the Soviets and the Brits felt that the downsides were acceptable. The US didn't really go for rear-engine transmissions until the advent of the Hydromatic, which was generally just, put it in drive and go. And of course, large, easy to maintain and rugged transmissions are a little bit heavier, so there's a bit of weight balance issue involved as well. However, yes, there probably was some institutional inertia as well. A country wasn't about to muck around too much with what worked without a very good reason to do so. If the vehicles were operating satisfactorily, was the potential benefit truly worth any potential risks or deficiencies? Case in point, the M18, designed to operate with the 4GAA, but as the engine hadn't been truly proven yet, they sacrificed 100 horsepower and probably a few inches of deck height in order to get the vehicle fielded with an engine that they were comfortable with. There's a saying about changing horses mid-race. If they don't need to, well, maybe they shouldn't. Anyway, Nuxus. In World War II, the Germans experimented with S-mine launchers on tanks, and more recently claymores were proposed for anti-infantry defense. Do these ideas have any merit? In theory, yes. Due to issues found in the Pacific involving Japanese soldiers getting up close and personal to US tanks in the thick jungle terrain, the US also conducted such experiments, varying from simply taping hand grenades to the outsides of a tank with detonator wire running to the inside, to slightly more purpose-designed systems, which were in effect precursors to claymores on the tanks. German vehicles eventually fitted the Nahverteidigungswaffe. You know where I'm going. It could fire smoke or frag rounds. Even today, it is possible to fit a HE or fragmentation grenade into a vehicle smoke grenade launcher, if you spend the money. For example, Wegmann's 76mm vehicle grenade launchers are available in smoke only or multi-purpose, the latter launchers being a little bit reinforced. So yes, the idea does have merit, although obviously you need to be a little bit careful about any friendly infantry in the area. However, it seems that the best solution as implemented seems to be to just try to keep the enemy infantry away from your vehicles in the first place, which can be done reasonably well by use of your own friendly infantry. Caleb Engelhardt. I'm going to add your mind exploded question to my ever-increasing list of questions which deserve a video of their own. Felicity Longus has two. 1. Why are automatic grenade launchers not more commonly seen on tanks? Fair question, as it seems to me that there's no reason you can't put a 40mm machine gun instead of either the Lotus 240 or maybe even the TC's 50, especially on the Crows mount on the A2s. And I'm fairly sure I have seen it done for the sake of the trial, although I'm unable to find a photo right now. After all, you get a little bit of high explosive effect for trenches and buildings without resorting to the 120. While the machine gun requirements can be handled by the coax and or caliber 50 depending on which gun you swap out. Now, I don't know if I've ever seen a proper answer, but I think it's more a matter that if the tank is around, the chances are that there's a Bradley nearby. And the 25mm HEI is even better at dealing with those sorts of targets than the Mark 19 in most cases, which, with the Mark 19, face it, it makes an already big silhouette even bigger. If you replace the Lotus 240 with a 40mm, then you're adding yet another ammunition type to the combat load instead of sharing with the coax, and if you put the Mark 19 on instead of the caliber 50, well, you're reversing some of the advantages to the low-profile Crows, which was developed to not block the view of the TC. So that's for the Americans. Why don't other nations stick something on, especially vehicles which have the RWS located elsewhere on the turret roof, like way behind? Your guess is as good as mine, but I do note that most other countries tend to prefer to put smaller guns on their RWS, like a 7.62. A Mark 19 or equivalent may simply be too big for their comfort or doctrine. He also wants to know if I have any insight on the MPF. Do I think the Army's finally on its way to get a new tank, or will this be a repeat of the AGS, with the GDLS program to join M8 in acquisition purgatory? Well, to a very large extent, the vehicle is more of an assault gun than a tank, with a few features installed which are reflective of the fact that it will be operating in very close cooperation with infantry. The vehicle is entering low rate in initial production, so I don't see why it's not going to be fielded. Now, I've crawled over and in both the GDLS and BAE vehicles, and though both have the good points, my personal opinion from what I saw is that the correct vehicle was selected. More on that in a future video. John Zabala, why was the M26 phased out so quickly in favor of the M46, 47 and 48? Was it the size of the tank or something else? More the engine than the tank. The M46 is in effect an M26 with a new powertrain. Coming in at over 30% heavier than the late production M4 but with the same engine, it was inevitable that there would be problems. They weren't all that evident in the limited use that the tank had in World War II, but they were well known by Korea. So, M46 was basically a band-aid on the M26, but the Army already felt that the M26-46 design was obsolescent and could be improved. The T-42 medium was developed in effect as the successor vehicle. The turret, with a rangefinder and better shape, was inherently better than that of an M46, but the problem was that the powertrain that they had just wasn't doing the job. When the Korean War and the tank panic kicked off, the US, knowing that it was in a fighting war which could expand and that its tanks were basically World War II capability, decided that the easiest thing to do was to upgrade the power of the M46 by swapping it to a new improved turret, that of T-42, but keeping the generally acceptable powertrain, the low hull. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't what the US Army wanted in the long term, but it's what the US Army could build right now, as it were. In the meantime, work was started on a true improved tank, T-48, which would end up as the M48. With the emergency need being met by the crash program of M47, the Americans could work on a much better tank. In this, it is very similar to the British position at the end of World War II, where Comet, a tank on the verge of obsolescence as soon as it came off the factory floor, was used to provide an improved capability pending the third development of Centurion. Thus, when M48 entered production, M47 suffered the same fate as Comet, a very short frontline service life, replaced by a far superior tank, and forced to look for second careers in other nations. Given the amount of nations which were running Shermans after World War II donated by the US, it is not surprising that they accepted the gift of M47s, which were surplus to US requirements, and thus were broadly fielded around the world. He also asks, did the US ever test the concept of the Squeezebore gun, like the Germans? The idea goes back to 1895 in the Mexican Mondragon, the first semi-auto rifle, and the history of taper bores mainly revolves around small arms, less than around vehicles. Technically, the Mondragon was a stepped bore sabot instead of a taper bore, but in any case, the US was certainly well aware of the taper bore concept. Springfield Armory made its first taper bore by modifying in 1903 for .338 to .308 after looking at Karl Puff's rifle. In 1932, a German named Hermann Gerlich visited Aberdeen Proving Grounds with his taper bore, 7mm Ultra, which started at 8.9mm and came out the other end at 7mm and over 4,400 feet per second. It would punch through a half-inch of armor at 300 yards. As a result, Springfield and Frankfurt arsenals had another crack, with a 30 to 24 cal rifle, but there were some errors in the design and it failed. A 1937 Springfield attempt at a 30 cal to .22 cal hit 7,000 feet per second with a 45 grain bullet. The next gun the Americans tried was the Janacek adapter in July 1939, which is basically fitted onto the end of an otherwise normal rifle. The ones fired were an 11 to 7.9mm rifle and a 15 to 11mm gun. Accuracy was poor, but the rounds were coming out the other end at over 4,100 feet per second and punching through an inch of armor at 100 yards. The US decided to concentrate instead, though, on high-velocity straight-bore guns, but present at the demonstration was a British military attaché. Ordnance suggested that, well, maybe the British, in the form of Vickers Armstrong, might be interested in pursuing the item, but the Americans decided against. Eventually, this would become the Little John adapter for the 2-pounder. Interest in the concept returned after encountering the German Panzer 41 in North Africa. The US developed a 57/40, which seemed to generally use the Janacek concept of an adapter on the end of the standard 57mm gun. The result was solid steel projectiles fired at 5,200 feet per second, and a carbide core would come out at 4,200. By the time the program was completed in 1945, the adapter had a life of about 200 rounds, and problems with accuracy had been solved to the point that it could expect to hit within about 7 inches at 1,000 yards. Compare that to about 3 feet at 1,000 yards for sabot. Two items worked against the taper bore. First, the US decided that as most engagements would occur at under 1,000 yards, sabot accuracy would be serviceably good, and HVAP seemed to be doing well enough as it was. Plus, HVAP was really easy to make. You just shoved a 57mm projectile core into a 76mm gun, or a 76mm projectile core into a 90mm gun, that sort of thing. And of course, putting the adapter on the end rather limits possibilities of firing anything other than armor-piercing rounds, because you're firing smaller warheads with smaller projectiles and less HE. After the war, taper bore was still played with, though mainly again back at the small arms, with a couple of attempts made towards an anti-aircraft function. Joe Barrett. Suppose the Irish government has seen fit to bestow a generous and overdue increase in the defence spending of the Irish Army and has mandated that these funds go partly to the adoption of a modest number of tracked AFVs. What would you select? Well, the reality is I probably wouldn't. The Irish Department of Defence has been critically underfunded for many, many years. About 2 years ago, the government asked a commission on the Defence Forces to look into the state of the Defence Forces. And it was long expected that, like every other white paper or report, it would be buried. Ireland has no enemies, and there were more hospitals to fund, right? Well, sure enough, the report comes out earlier this year in 2022, and it basically says the Defence Forces are stupidly underfunded to include, but not exclusive to, air defence and cyber defence. But AFVs were called out in the report as well. Unfortunately for the government, at exactly the time the report came out, the Russians started playing silly buggers off the Irish waters and then went and launched its Ukraine invasion. The response to the Russian fleet manoeuvres was that a bunch of angry fishermen went out from Cork to make a nuisance of themselves. The naval service was unable to do very much. All this was rather preventing the report from going unnoticed, as I have to assume the government would have preferred. The result has been that the government has been forced to pay attention and has decided to at least make a modicum increase in funding. Not as much as the report really wanted, but something. I've put a link to the report below if anyone cares. With respect to AFVs, it states the following. The current fleet of 80 MOAGs, and that's basically piranhas, for whatever reason Irish military, they tend to refer to pieces of equipment by the manufacturer. The current fleet of 80 MOAGs are primarily deployed on UN missions and are only used at home for training to include pre-deployment training. Within the limitations of the current fleet, this deployment pattern leaves no capacity for unit training or tactical exercises with armour for national defence. It also limits any additional rapid reaction capability to meet UN or EU requirements or commitments. There is a significant deficiency in this regard at present. The reality is there are so many more things for the Defence Forces to spend money on before even getting to new AFVs, like an air search radar, that getting to tracked AFVs seems improbable. The report indicates that the current MOAG Piranha fleet is inadequate, so that's where the money will go to, more MOAG Piranhas. Otherwise, to directly answer the question, probably a CV-90 based vehicle, simply because of how often Irish forces deploy in mixed battalions with Swedes, Finns, Dutch, or other CV-90 users. Did I have a favourite armoured vehicle growing up as a young lad? Probably Chieftain. It's the sort of tank that if you were a 10-year-old kid and you wanted to draw a tank, you'd draw that. It helped by my having the Chieftain Mark V Tamiya kit as a young lad. It came along just after the Leopard kit. Striker 1959. Why didn't the US consider autocannons like other nations did in the interwar period as tank armament? Probably because the M2 caliber 50 existed in the US inventory and they could use that without having to invent anything else. Thunderchild. Preferred pizza. Ham and mushroom. Maybe with garlic, certainly oregano. How might late Cold War vehicles be simplified to cut cost and production time if the US got to the point that it ran out of M1s in a war? Asking for a Twilight 2000 type scenario. Whilst the concept of down-teching seems reasonable enough, I'm not sure the US can actually do it. Is there any factory in the US capable of making castings the size of an M60 hull these days? I generally don't know. Neither do I know how many people have the knowledge to make and run such machines. What made the US's production capability as great as it was in World War II wasn't dropping down to a low common tech denominator for industry as a whole, it was in finding efficiencies in production. So for example, aircraft will be built to a known obsolescence standard at a factory in order to not have to slow the production line to retool or to make improved parts. These would then be shipped to a modification facility to upgrade it to the latest standards. It may seem less efficient, but in actuality it allowed maximum production from a facility at whatever standard that facility was at. I suspect something similar would happen today. Manufacturers would make what they could, and the highest end producers would focus on just the components which are unique to their skill set, thus resulting in high quality product. Of course, that's assuming that the environment is such that such national level cooperation is still possible. It is Twilight 2000 after all. Windwalker 57. Is there any combat vehicle which turned out to be bad at the job it was designed for, but good at some other purpose? The one which immediately comes to mind is the M8 armoured car, the Greyhound. It was originally designed to be a 37mm gun motor carriage, a tank destroyer. By the time it was ready, it was really obvious that a 37mm wasn't going to cut it, so the prototype was sent around a bit. Armoured Force decided it was good enough to become an armoured car until something better came along. It may not have been the best armoured car of World War II, but it was good enough. And then of course you've also got things like Covenanter, which didn't work as a gun tank, but they used it for AVLBs and things like that. Kevin Copeland, has the origin of calling the gunner's control handles Cadillacs ever been sourced? Well, the ones on M48s were labelled Cadillac, and that's probably it. USA, what's in the display case on the wall on your left? Which I presume is that one in your context. Coins. It's mainly an American thing, but I've noticed that the tradition has moved across the Atlantic because there's an Irish one in there. Generally speaking, it is a small token of appreciation, which you then place on your coin stand in your office, or in this case on your Love Me wall. In theory, they are ranked. If there is a coin check at the bar, the lowest ranking coin buys the drinks, which leads to a bit of a problem. So my highest ranking coin is from the Joint Chiefs, but it's also one I dare not take out and about with me in case I lose it. So dining ins can be quite energetic after all. So the normal thing to do on a coin check is just make sure you actually have one regardless of what the rank is. Normally, one person or another will forget to bring theirs. Christopher Hewitt, how is the recovery of vehicles achieved in the modern US military? Now, for that, I would refer you to my 20-minute piece over in Perun's video on captured equipment, and it'll get you most of the way there. There are also some manuals cited for further information for your reading. TN Jeep, is there a vehicle I had an opportunity to operate but passed on it and now regret? No, I will try to drive anything anyone will let me. James Ice, is there a sci-fi weapon that you don't care how impractical or how dumb it seems, you want to get one? The Kilo Zap gun seems eminently practical. I shall read you the description. Quote, the designer had clearly not been instructed to beat about the bush. Make it evil, he'd been told. Make it totally clear that this gun has a right end and a wrong end. Make it totally clear to anyone standing at the wrong end that things are going badly for them. If that means sticking all sorts of spikes and prongs and blackened bits all over it, then so be it. This is not a gun for hanging over the fireplace or sticking in the umbrella stand. This is a gun for going out and making people miserable with. Probably very suitable for home defense. Which now brings us to Gun of the Month. And this is not a Steyr AUG. You see, the problem is, when I purchased this weapon, I lived in California. California has what is known as the assault weapon ban. There are various rifles that they think are evil and should not be owned by civilians. And the Steyr AUG is one of those weapons. So, much as my FNFAL is actually an SG-58 by DS Arms, this is an American manufacturer. The TPD AXR, Tactical Product Design, out of Beaverton, Oregon. You thought I was going to say MSAR, didn't you? So the story kind of goes, this guy used to make knives of all things up there, and he decided that at the time, because Steyr was no longer importing and building locally, he would make his own Steyr. And it came out just before the MSAR. Everything is done to NATO, Steyr standard. So unlike the MSAR, which I think the parts don't really intermesh correctly. And the receiver is made slightly differently to the Steyr receiver, but generally speaking, if something breaks, you can replace it with a Steyr part and it'll work fine. And this is part of my collection of firearms from the Irish military. So again, I can't have a true Steyr AUG, or at least I couldn't at the time, and I'm not going to buy another one now. So the AXR is what it is. Now, there has some features I like and some I'm not so keen on. The little forward hand grip that they have, I know anytime I fire it, the gas port is right here and comes on my hand, so if you're not wearing gloves, it's a problem. On the other hand, being as it is a bullpup and thus very nicely balanced, I normally will shoot it like an old competition air rifle, just on the trigger guard like this, perfectly reasonable, perfectly accurate standing, sitting, or whatever else. Now, one of my issues with this, other than the handguard, is that there's no bolt release. So in theory, if you want to lock the bolt to the rear, you pull this down and it goes into a little tab up here. Changing magazines, the only way to get the magazine, the next round chambered, is you got to go back to the handle and kick it forward. Now the problem I have is if you put an optic on this, I've got some fairly big hands. I'm going to come back and I'm going to scrape my hand on the optic mount. And before I put these vortexes on, I had an EOTech, and it had the same problems. It's not just the bumps here, it's an issue with the design. Again, the Steyr was designed with that integrated donut of death, the by 1.5 optic, not with this rail mount, but modern rifles, you need a rail mount. Even the Irish have gone to a rail mount now. So you got your mag releases back here or under here. Now, something else that the Steyr has, of course, is its proprietary magazine, which is translucent. Well, I got a NATO stock, and so my translucent magazine is actually a Lancer. This L5, I think Lancer make more modern ones, and I got this nearly 20 years ago. But it does the job. I really have no complaints about these Lancers. I took them to Iraq with me and Afghanistan, actually, now I think about it. And they worked fine. They're translucent, so you can see how many rounds you have left. All is well. A couple of other nice features. It's the only rifle I have where you can disassemble it very easily. So if I can remember how you do it. So in theory, I gotta pull this back again. If I'm transporting this to the range in my shoulder bag or something like that, it makes it already a little bit smaller. Now, again, there's a little bit of a catch with it. What number is this anyway? 78, rifle number 78. If I recall, there were only 200 that were built with this longer barrel. And living in California, even though the AXR was not banned by name, there are still various feature requirements. So it had to be more than 30 inches long, stem to tip. And the standard barrel was too short. So when TPD announced the longer barrel, I bought it, and it thus made it California legal. TPD, by the way, basically shut down. I don't think they went bankrupt. They just disappeared shortly after that. And I'm fairly sure that for quite a length of time, I had the only AXR in California. There are other modifications made, minor ones. So if you pull out the trigger pack, pull this out right quick. You can see I've got a little piece of metal in here. And what I have done is I've installed a modified retainer for the spring tension. And when the AUG came out, it has a fairly heavy trigger. The AXR, it's about 9 pounds. And this is now down to about 5. It came in a set of 4. There's actually an even lighter trigger that I could have on this, but it's a little bit too far. And for folks a lot of folks complain that, bullpup triggers are too too tough, shall we say. I'm not convinced by the argument because, you know, this is a combat rifle. If you're in combat, your fine muscle control isn't really happening. So you just you just pull the trigger, you know, gross motor movements, and you're fine. The stripping and assembling it's fine. There are other videos that show you how to strip and assemble it. Of course, being a semi-auto, you don't get the neat pull it a little bit for one bang, pull it all the way in for multiple bangs. And right, that's it's basically the AXR. I really like this. I mean, it's not my go-to rifle, but I don't know, it just has a lot of character to it. So anyway, enough of the rifle. Back to the questions. Anthony Gardner. In an episode of a Russian program covering the T-34, the museum staff recalled the story of an American visitor, a military historian, who, upon appreciating that the track pins were forced into position by the wedge upon every revolution, remarked, "Well, that's unfair." Was this you? And is this a quality of life feature when performing track maintenance or replacement? It probably was me. It's the sort of thing I might say. It's a case of short-term versus long-term benefits. In the short term, yeah, not checking for end connector slippage or loose nuts, and breaking track is easy. A little bit of quality of life for the crews there. The problem is in the long term, with the wear on the system or how often pins or tracks need to be replaced or are broken, things like that. And I have seen track pins that are simply out too far, and instead of getting hit back into place, they get simply bent. Tim Dalrymple. So we've heard about what the US Army thought about the M4, but what about the Marines? Did they have any specific variant that they seemed to prefer, or was it simply whichever M4 could carry the most crayons? It seems to have depended upon whom you spoke with. The Corps itself had a preference for the M4A375, but were also very enthusiastic users of the 105mm Sherman and its successor, the 105mm Pershing, better known as the M45. The gun was plenty good enough against anything it came up against in terms of armor, and the HE charge was better than that of the 76, so the Marines were in no hurry to upgun. The US Army may have wanted to stop production of 75mm tanks in January of 44, but they weren't the only users of the vehicle. There was some debate from the users, though, who preferred the M4A2, which the Corps took delivery of because there was no A3 allocation available at the time. These users believed that the diesel resulted in a lesser fire chance, and this was actually a similar theory to North Africa, and that the extra range allowed by the diesel motor made up for the lack of power and the complexity of two engines. There are reports of some units complaining when they were told to turn in their diesels for petrol burners. Christian B. Hybrid drives and see-through armor. Well, that's a bit of an overlap with my Abrams X/KF51 video, but yes, hybrids do seem to be on the cusp of being acceptable, and improvements continue to be made for VR transparent armor, although I don't think we're quite as close with the VR as we are with the hybrids. Entry-level research. What might a veteran World War II American tanker crew verbalize when suddenly taking fire from the right and then return fire? I can find the official commands, but I haven't seen the contact right equivalent, and neither have I. For those who haven't seen it, the manual for crew commands in World War II is far less comprehensive than in the manuals of today. There is a lot which is left undescribed, and we are forced to extrapolate from whatever else we can find, and that includes react to contact drills for the tank, so I can't give an official answer there either. Second, the T-24E1 referenced in Honeycutt's Stuart had an R975-C4 on rails. What would the advantages have been, and what might have been the fix for the Spicer transmission? I can't find any reports on it. What Honeycutt says seems to be the best that's out there. The only documentation I can find basically says same as T-24, with the exception of maximum speed improved from 35 miles an hour to 48. If there was to be an improvement, it would probably be through the use of the same transmission power plant combination of the M18. However, there is one other factor. The twin Cadillac V8s were very quiet compared to the Continental Radial. And even if they had been able to figure out the mechanical issues of putting the radial into the tank, there is a fair question to be asked as to whether they really wanted the noise and time liabilities of the radial to go with the power advantage on what was in effect a scout tank. Robert Olweiler. The 90s were a sad time for the military enthusiast, with lots of cool and promising systems being killed off following the collapse of the USSR. What were the various countries working on and what might have been useful? Well, two which immediately come to mind are the M8 armor gun system and the FOG-M missile system. Now, there are lots of other systems out there, such as a staff round or LOSAT, which lasted quite a bit beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall, but they still fell to budget cuts. It's a little bit harder to figure out the Russian stuff, since it's not entirely clear how much vehicles such as Black Eagle were supposed to be developments with the intent of fielding versus merely tech development platforms. One must wonder if the Cold War ending had any effect on the Brazilian Ossorio, the same with the AMX-40. Whatever the chances those vehicles had, the demand for tanks shot down, and the peace dividend meant that people who did want tanks could just buy cheap Leopards. Something similar seems to have happened to vehicles like the Mars 15. In addition to new vehicles going by the wayside, upgrade projects were as well. So, for example, the Super M48 was a massive upgrade to the M48. You could even get it with a GT601 gas turbine if you wanted. However, for the sake of the experiment, I grabbed early and late 1990s copies of Jane's Armour and Artillery to see what was listed as projects which may have been cancelled, just doing a comparison. And it's actually very difficult to point to anything and say this was cut due to the Cold War cutbacks, as opposed to it just didn't work. For example, the 1991 book mentions the Advanced Field Artillery System, which seems to have progressed to Crusader, and then of course it was cancelled. Or ADAX, not yet in production for the US Army on Bradleys, which of course then never went anywhere. But was that because of the peace dividend or because of something else? It's a fair question though. I'll be interested to see other people's suggestions in the comments below. Dan Robertson. What do the higher-ups think of my YouTube career? I've got to be one of the highest profile lieutenant colonels in the army. It hasn't really come up. At this time of recording, I'm hitting 250,000 subscribers, which, all things considered, isn't all that huge compared to some. Most people in the army will not have heard of me, which seems to include the higher-ups. If they have, they're generally doing what I do and keeping my civilian and military personas reasonably separate. So, though a few people have seen me around and said hi, none of them have been in my chain of command, and I don't have really very much reason to bring it up. Nuclear Puker. Just how useful is a thermal CITV versus a non-thermal commander's viewer on a vehicle which already has a thermal imager for the gun? Not having used a thermal CITV equipped tank outside of a simulator, I'm probably not in a great position to say from experience. I would think that the leap in capability from a non-thermal equipped vehicle to a thermal equipped vehicle is far greater than the leap from a thermal equipped vehicle to a dual thermal equipped vehicle. I'm reminded of the M1s that were fielded to the Marines just to give them a couple of thermals. Most of the units kept the M60s, but they had the M1s along just to spot things. But if anybody has quantified the advantage of going to dual thermal, I've not seen the figures. Seems to me that it's worth the cost though, if you can afford it, especially nowadays when we seem to have far more that we need to scan than we used to. I have a suspicion that nowadays more than one CITV in a platoon is going to be kept scanning not the terrain, which is also being scanned by gunners, but the skies. Drones will show up far faster on a thermal scan than on a visible spectrum system, for example, and that could give you the advanced warning that you need to prepare to receive incoming fire. Another important point is that we're fighting at night a lot more. If you don't have a thermal imager on your commander's viewer, you are reducing the capability of your tank for half of the day. Obviously not to zero. M1A1s and Challenger 2s have shown that they're still very lethal in the darkness. but certainly not to the capability of later vehicles. If I'm not paying for it, then absolutely, I would much rather have a CITV than a CIV. But it's nowhere near the liability of supposedly modern tanks which don't have a thermal imager of any sort mounted on them, such as are often seen in Ukraine. White Sagittarius. What were the major turning points in North Africa, other than Second El Alamein? Tobruk is probably the most significant one. It really held up the German counterattacks. Not only did it deny the port as a source of supply for the Germans, but it also sat right on the roads, making movement past it difficult. Other operations like Crusader or Compass were significant, but I don't know if they were particularly course-changing. Obviously, Kasserine gets a mention as well. After the Germans were defeated there, the movement of the Allies into Tunis from the west was pretty much unstoppable. See also El Guitar and Longstop Hill. Robert Naborny. The 76mm gun was viewed as a failure when introduced in 1944, yet 6 years later in Korea, 76mm M4s did great against the vaunted T-34-85. Was the availability of ammunition such as HVAP? Superior American training or tactics? Or was it some other factor? Yes, to all three. First, I'll question if the 76 was considered a failure. Yes, there is the famous comment by Ike that now I'm being told we can't kill a thing with it. But the reality was that the gun was doing well enough overall. Nobody complained about the M18 being underarmed with the same gun, for example. Firstly, the Korean War M4s were not going up against stupidly heavy tanks. Now, in fairness, the IS-2 would have been a problem, and that wasn't an excessive tank like King Tigers or Panthers, but the reality was that a T-34-85 was well within the capabilities of the 76mm. HVAP was by then more readily available, the US had learned that lesson. And finally, US tankers were pretty reasonably trained and on a vehicle which overall was better than that of the opposition. Ankh Thi. We know the official reaction to field applique armor like concrete or sandbags was, it's not going to help his armor while only straining your suspension. But are there any formal studies done to test this? Or is it so blindingly obvious that it wasn't worth doing a formal study? Well, everything's always worth a formal study. And the British did a formal study and concluded that there was some beneficial effect to field expedient armor, although it only addressed the benefits and did not make any notice that I know of as to the long-term performance problems. However, US reports do note that British-shaped charges produce jets of lesser power than US or German charges. There is an interesting report from 1946, though. Our tank losses to their shaped charge weapons were so light that the necessary tests at Aberdeen could not be assigned high priorities. So for much of the war, there wasn't much of an effort, it seems. It's worth noting also the concern that not only might there be mobility issues, bridging issues were also a factor. According to the report, tank losses from Panzerfausts, basically in Italy, were near zero in early 1944 and rose to 12% in 1945, which, in fairness, though noticeable, isn't a huge amount. The official position of Aberdeen was, since sandbags were known to be almost useless for the purpose, which is why they moved to plastic HCR2 and spikes as their solutions. Now, I can't find the Aberdeen sandbag tests, but there is a comment in there that unless the material has at least twice the density of water, it's not going to have a notable effect on the shaped charge rounds. Fine sand, such as used in concrete, is not twice the density of water. And soil that you're filling a sandbag with, from just the dirt on the side of the road, is even less dense than that. It's worth noting that to provide a level of protection capable of stopping Panzerfausts, the estimate was that some 11.7 tons of HCR2, a substance specifically designed to stop Panzerfausts, would be required to be added to an M4. Suitable spike armor was estimated to weigh only 4.1 tons. And only. I mean, that's still more than a 10% increase. Bear in mind that even the re-geared M4A3E2 of about equal weight was accepted for limited operation. Sim Crawford. A while back I saw a video about a Challenger development mule, which had a sideways mounted camera for peeking around corners. It was deemed not worth it as crews were stopping at every turn just to be sure. Do you think that could be trained out of the crew, or that, nope, keeping 6 guys on foot spaced out is hard enough, tell them more right foot instead? In theory, it can be trained out. However, it seems to me that it is far faster to have one of the accompanying troops stick his head around the corner instead, or use a mirror or whatnot. I'm not going to say that such a look-around capability is never needed, but adding more and more sources of information will inevitably lead to slower action. My personal opinion is that combined arms, trusting the troops of other branches to work with you, should apply not only to firepower but also to observation and security. John Cryer, back in the day, he was in an armoured cavalry squadron under the H-Series MTO. This is John, of course. Then he changed to the J-Series, which at the time caused a lot of controversy with the idea of a loss of capability being thrown around. Here's what's changed. The H-Series Cavalry Regiment Squadron had a headquarters troop, 3 recon troops, a tank troop, and an artillery battery. Now, for those not in the US, a troop is a company-sized element in the US. For Americans, a troop in a lot of other countries is a platoon-sized element, and a squadron is a company-sized element. So I just wanted to clarify that. So American terminology in most of the rest of the world is different. The makeup of the recon troop was of 3 platoons. Each platoon came with a headquarters vehicle, either a MUT or an M113, a scout section of either 2 M113s or 4 MUTs, a section of 2 tanks, a rifle squad in an M113, and a 4.2-inch mortar track. And that is an extremely capable little combined arms formation, especially when one realizes that there's also an M109 battery on call for the squadron, plus a whole tank company for additional fire as needed. Now, the manual authorized a few other variations to the organization. One allowed the troop commander to concentrate his assets into an overstrength tank platoon, a slightly understrength rifle platoon, and a scout platoon, whilst retaining the 3 mortars under his control. The third option was to keep the scouts and mortars under troop control and to leave the platoons as tank infantry combined platoons. This certainly provided an array of options. I would refer you back to Q&A 16, in which I discuss recent US cavalry organization and the various roles that US cavalry has, which are a little bit different to other nations. They vary from scouting to major, decisively engaged combat. So, if just scouting, the combined arms at the platoon level organization is quite suitable. However, if you're expecting a high-intensity fight, there is merit to the organization which concentrates the unit types for maximum effect. The succeeding J-Series regimental cavalry troop downsized a little bit. There was now only 2 platoons, one of 6 scout vehicles, officially Bradleys, and one of 4 tanks. Headquarters had a tank in its section, and there were 2 mortars. The squadron retained its artillery battery and an independent tank company. In units which didn't have Bradleys, there was an M113/ITV mix. Obviously, the big difference in the two is the lack of dismounts. M3s only carry a couple of GIBs, that's guys in back, and there is slightly reduced capability in terms of variations of organization. There is a reduction in close terrain capability. Bradleys aren't small after all, and if it comes to checking out urban or forested areas, there's only so much that this reconfigured troop can do with fewer dismounts. On the other hand, it still has plenty of firepower to be capable of performing all 3 of the cavalry security taskings, whilst being capable of fighting for information on the mechanized battlefield. I take John's point that the new organization seemed optimized for facing the Red Horde in Germany, rather than for general purpose operations from, let's say, Germany to Vietnam, and from the perspective of the affected unit, I can see why it's a downgrade. However, in the later MTO's defense, I think it does better at one of the other cavalry functions, which is economy of force missions. That reduced manning in riflemen and mortars can now be diverted to the main combat battalions. Those little combined arms units may have been capable, but they don't seem to have been particularly efficient when compared to an armoured company team of regular infantry and tanks. So was the cavalry unit less capable as a result of the change? Yes, I would think so in terms of versatility. Was that a net downgrade for the army as a whole? I wouldn't go that far. The reconfigured cavalry unit was still capable of performing most of its required tasks, but did so more efficiently and in a few cases better. When talking about armor penetration, we hear things like, penetrates 30mm at 500 meters. Does this mean it will go through 30mm plate, but if it hits a 31mm plate, it will bounce off, shatter the shell, or dig into it with 1mm remaining? Would repeated impacts with a shell which can't penetrate fatigue it to the point of breaking? What do the numbers mean in real life terms? Well, as I've said in the past, real life doesn't care what the paper figures say. There have been plenty of examples of vehicles killed by guns which, according to the wargame figures, shouldn't have a hope of doing so. But that doesn't help the scientists or engineers. They need to put something in writing with a reasonable chance of accuracy. And, of course, like any experiment, the results will vary depending on what the criteria are. Normally, the protection or penetration figure is predicated on a likelihood level. More often than not, when you fire a round at 30mm of armor, it will penetrate. Not always, but a certain percentage of the time, be that 50% or 80% or whatever your standard is that you have chosen. Then there are different definitions of penetration. For example, the US Army definition was that daylight could be seen when looking through the impact. If the round was still stuck in the metal, you pull the round out and then you look and see if you can see daylight out the other side. If yes, you have penetrated. The Navy standard was more based on the weight of metal which got through the other side. If at least half the metal of the projectile got through, it was a complete penetration. Then again, the Germans were a bit more strict. They defined penetration on the basis of the shell getting through basically in one piece, so that the bursting charge and fuse would still be intact to detonate on the far side. There is an excellent overview of how different nations defined their penetration standards over on panzer-war.com. Look for the link below. The level of resistance to repeated impacts normally depends on how hard the armor is. Generally speaking, the harder the more brittle, so eventually the integrity will simply collapse. But again, it depends on what it's shooting at. Teku wants to know what, if anything, I found out about the T-28 in the archives. Not quite a bit, which I have distilled into just 8 pages in my book, Can Openers, which, by the way, as I'm recording this, is currently unavailable on Amazon. So I've spoken with the publisher, figuring out what's going wrong, and it will be back on sale in a week or two. Big D, thoughts on MPF. I refer the Honourable Gentleman to the answer I provided earlier. Still, there are a few obvious things that nobody seems to have commented upon. For example, has anybody copped the 2 large side doors on the vehicle? As people now start frantically Googling images of the thing. The Slaven. I didn't understand the question, but at my guess, the smaller nations found small tanks within their realm of domestic production capability and cost, so that's what they built. Cranen. Given the prevalence of 37mm and 40mm autocannons in the 1930s, and these were typical calibers for anti-tank guns, why didn't anyone try to put a Bofors gun into a 20-ton tank? Well, there was the Hungarian Nimrod and the related Anti-2, which I did a video on, the former of which was intended as a dual-role anti-aircraft and anti-armor vehicle. And of course, CV9040 shows that it's not impossible to stick the 40mm with a reasonable sized turret, although in fairness, the CV9040 is a little bit big by the standards of an interwar tank. It seems to me that it came down mainly to just size and keeping the vehicle down to a typical size of the era. I would refer to the attempts to build an automatic 37mm for the M5 Stuart, and it required displacing the commander to have anything more than 3 rounds ready to fire. A single shot weapon is also smaller and lighter, so at the time that size was as important as it was, especially given power limitations of the engines to haul the vehicle around, it's not surprising that befores were not commonly mounted. Josh Conti, was the M103 outmatched by the Soviet tanks that it was facing by the mid-1970s? To a large extent, yes. It at least, however, gave a pretty solid chance at killing things like T-64s and T-62s, which the Marine M48s with 90mm guns may have had some trouble with. Once the M60s showed up with 105s, things got a lot better, and the M60 could do, generally speaking, the job better than the M103. However, it is also worth observing that the Marines weren't exactly supposed to be on the front line of battle in the inner German border, so the heavy tank was, I would believe, more a case of insurance in case something odd showed up where the Marines went, like the Egyptian IS-3s or some such. Robert Naborny, what's the deal with the supposedly early M1 hitting 100 miles an hour with the governor removed? I have not seen anything in the written record as yet confirming this. The official maximum speed in testing was somewhere over 50 miles an hour, or 90 kilometers an hour. However, I will not immediately discount the possibility of substantially higher speeds being attained, at least briefly. I have no faith that the running gear would be able to hold itself together for any length of time at higher speeds. He has also heard that M1 side skirts are a descendant of Schutzen, but also observes that the US was playing with side skirts before that, such as T14 and M6 Heavy. Quite correct, and in fact the idea of skirting covering the tanks was a very common design feature. Look at the French FCM-36, Somewhere S-35 and Char B1 for example. The British World War I tanks almost all had enclosed running gear, as did a lot of the interwar vehicles. Everyone understood the advantages of skirting before the disadvantages appeared of maintenance and mud accumulation. So overall, the idea has come and gone with different solutions implemented to deal with the maintenance and mud problems. As for the question of man hours of maintenance per hour of use, I do have some tables for man hours of maintenance for operating Shermans and testing in 2 articles, Testing British Cruisers and Exercise Dracula. Links below. However, I'd caution against drawing too many conclusions on the British figures in those reports though, as the vehicles were far from ready for production at the time. I've been accused of bashing the British vehicles with these reports because obviously later on they were perfectly reasonable. The advantage to these reports though is they show you what the Sherman was at the time, and that's really what I'm looking to do here, is as opposed to try to knock on the British. The British vehicles were simply far from ready for production at the time of these tests. The Sherman figures, though, should be pretty much on par with reality. And I don't think I have the German figures handy. That Spartan Gamer. What's the process for earning a Stetson and Spurs in an armoured cav unit? Does this differ from air cav? I can't really answer the air cav question, but I've no reason to believe that it's different from armoured cav. The Stetson, or cav hat, as it doesn't actually need to be a Stetson and mine isn't, need not be earned. You can wear it if you're in a cav unit. Spurs, however, do need to be earned. I got mine the easy way, combat deployment. Those are gold Spurs. The alternative is to do what is known as a spur ride. It's kind of like the cavalry version of the EIB, the Expert Infantry Badge. A day or 3 of general misery, performing tasks at various stations to a standard. They vary from combat-related tasks like vehicle ID or call for fire to tasks related to cavalry heritage and history. Although I note that learning the words to Gary Owen seems not to ever be one of those stations. And it's one word, not 2. It's a town just outside of Limerick. If you do complete the spur ride, and I'm sure you can find photos and videos of these things in progress, you will be awarded silver Spurs. Run On has a follow-on for my question about using range cards for blind fire with non-area of effect weapons like armor piercing. In theory, sure, but I wouldn't put any expectation beyond pure blind luck unless there's a homing system on the end of the projectile like Copperhead or MRM had. George Wood, did the Soviets copy the jerrycan? Yes, they did. Although they were introduced to the concept from captured German stocks, they didn't really have too huge a need to build their own for a while, as the Americans were quite happy to provide via Lend-Lease. However, apparently by 1944, the Soviets had commenced production of their own ones in Latvia. It seems that they used sort of cylindrical barrels prior, but I haven't been able to find a photograph after a quick look. But interestingly, they were early adopters of the tanker truck for refueling. See Q&A number 9 for the Americans. VJCR, how did the Canadian Kangaroo series of vehicles come about? The idea of a turretless tank to play troop carrier was more than just the Ram Kangaroo that we all know and love. The full-tracked APC predated the war, such as the Lorraine L-38. Technically, actually, the Mark IX of World War I. So the concept isn't entirely new. But there was certainly a debate as to the merits of the expense in creating a tank chassis for the job when things like half-tracks were cheaper. However, as tanks became more obsolete, they were often deturreted for other use. The first one which immediately comes to mind is the Stuart. In North Africa, they were deturreted by the British, firstly for reconnaissance purposes. It was much easier to scout around with the turretless vehicle, and the 37mm wasn't particularly missed by that point. However, it was also noted that such a turretless Stuart wasn't too far removed from a universal carrier for transport purposes, so the Stuart Kangaroo was born, even if it wasn't often referred to as such. Whether aware of this conversion or not, the next crack at it came with the defrocked Priest. M7 howitzer motor carriages with the gun removed, the hull blanked over, and climbing steps added. Being a nice, spacious vehicle, it carried a good infantry section. Still, it is a fairly large vehicle, and the armour wasn't great. The Ram Kangaroo was probably one of the more successful variants, as it had a reasonable amount of armour. Since a lot of the Rams were also built with the obsolete machine gun turret on the hull, it meant that the Ram Kangaroo could carry troops in relative safety under armour, and it was still equipped with an armoured turret for defence or suppression purposes. Other versions were also made out of other vehicles, normally at least retaining a ball mount machine gun, but that's still not as good as having a proper turret. A variant was proposed for the M18 as well, capable of carrying personnel, although it was more intended to carry scouts. The US wasn't that short on half-tracks to general infantry transport, but the M18 was better for keeping up with the other cavalry vehicles that the US had. Eventually, of course, it wasn't adopted, and the T-20 was the closest thing that the US used. G. Bosman, no, I have absolutely no intention of doing a 6+ hour long Q&A. Drakenfell may have set the standard on that, but I have my sanity and a family and several other jobs. And with that, I'm calling it quits. I don't think I'll be doing another 2-camera presentation again until the new year, so enjoy your holidays. I'll talk to you on the other side, and if you are in Ireland, maybe there'll be a Dublin meetup. Just keep it on my Facebook page. All right, take care.